what motivated you finally to go into politics? You're an accomplished author, you're an accomplished journalist, you live here in Telluride, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a good life, you know.
Yeah.
You've done a lot. So what moved you and said, like, okay, damn it, I'm going to hit the road with this?
Well, we sold our newspaper about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a rough adjustment to not having that in our lives, my wife and I, because it was our lives. It kept us really busy, and it was our basis for engaging with the community, and it was our social life and our professional life and everything. So when that went away, it's been a period of adjustment, what to do next. And I'm not sure we've totally figured out what to do next, but like millions and millions and tens of millions of other people, I was shocked and upset by Trump's victory in the last election, and went through a process that I think a lot of people went through: disbelief, rage, rationalizing, depression. Like, what do we do about it? And it took me a while. I mean, I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't have any big ideas. The thing about a political event like that is it makes us all feel powerless. Almost nobody, not even Barack Obama, not even Hillary Clinton, not even the CIA, not even nobody can fix it. There's nobody who can fix it. And much less me living in this little town in the middle of nowhere, with my resources, can't fix it. But I kind of heard the call that people were putting out there: just run for something. Just run for something was kind of the expression that was going around. And a year ago, not quite a year ago, but I think it was in November. I can't remember for sure. Yeah, it was in November, when the legislative elections in Virginia happened. The state legislative elections in Virginia, and they did an amazing thing. I mean, they won so many races, and against tremendous odds, because the state had been gerrymandered like crazy, and the Republicans had been in control of that state government for years, and they still won. They didn't quite get control back, but they won a huge number of seats, and it was really inspiring. I mean, it was like, wow, those people didn't just sit back and worry and stress. They got active and they did something. And then the same thing happened again in Alabama when Doug Jones won. But I had decided before Alabama that I was going to do this because that was so inspiring. It's like, and it turned out to be true that that doing something feels a whole lot better than sitting back and worrying.
So you made that decision. How can we imagine your day as a candidate?
Well, part of what's been good about it, apart from that I don't feel powerless anymore, I feel like there's something I can do. It may not, I can't run for Congress, I can't run for president, but at least I'm doing something. And so that's really good psychologically for anybody. Once you get involved and you stop feeling powerless, that's the antidote to depression. So that's the good news. But the other thing that's good about it is it forced me to really think hard about what it means to run for office, what it means to convince people to vote for you, what works, what doesn't work, what are the issues. And I'm running in a district that voted for Trump by 30 percentage points. It's a plus 30-point Trump district. It's a very conservative district. And so the only way to win is to win a lot of conservative votes and a lot of Republican votes. And I don't think I am going to win, honestly. I'm going to try to win. Maybe I will win, but it's very tough to overcome a 30-point deficit when, in any district, in any election. Even in the special elections that have been happening around the country where Democrats have won in Trump districts, very few of them have been plus 30. Plus 20 is good. I mean, some people have won plus 20 districts. I think a couple have won plus 30 districts. But so it's been really interesting to think about, like how do I talk to these people? What can I say that might win their vote? What can we do to try to move the needle and maybe maybe move some of these people who voted for Trump and have been voting for Republicans for a generation or two. What can we do to move them to a more liberal point of view? And
let me just ask you there. What do you mean when you say liberal?
Well, I've been thinking about that a lot too. I mean, one of the interesting things about running is you think about all these terms and what they mean. So really the classic definition of liberal is that we believe government can do good things for people. That's the definition of liberal. And it's just amazing that the Republicans, ever since Nixon, have turned it into a slur. You know, it's the best way you can slander a politician is calling them liberal, which is really wrong. And the Democrats are so afraid of the word liberal that they've started calling themselves progressive. And now that's a dirty word. So it didn't do any good to change the word. We need to own up to the fact that we believe government can help people and government can solve problems and not be afraid of it. And that's really important to me. So, yeah, I'm a liberal and I don't mind saying it. I think we need to say it.
So now then let's go a step further. So government can do good things for the people. Government is needed. You said it's about the issues, you know.
Right.
You thought about the issues. So what are the issues?
Well, I've learned a lot going door to door and talking to voters. And one of the main things I've come to understand very clearly is that there's not really any disagreement about what the big problem is. Like liberals, conservatives, religious people, atheists, hippies, cops, military people, everyone knows what the problem is. The problem is that tens of millions of people who used to be in the middle class have been pushed into economic hard times. And that, you know, and I just avoided saying the word poverty, which is probably wrong, but these folks don't like to think of themselves as poor. That's painful for them to hear. But they recognize they're poor if you talk about it. But the problem in American life is that since the 1970s, starting with Ronald Reagan, there has been a huge transfer of wealth from the middle class to the rich, to the upper class. And the middle class has fallen into a state of poverty. I just said it. I'm going to say it. It's poverty. That's what it is. And one reason I know that now is because I've been knocking on doors in this district and I can see it with my own two eyes.
Right. What does the poverty, how can we visualize that state of being?
Well, part of the reason the poverty is hidden from us, there's a lot of reasons it's hidden from us. One reason is we're afraid to say the word poverty. Another reason is that Americans have been segregating. We've been moving into communities where we live with people at our own income levels and suburbs and towns. And so we live in places where most of the other people are more or less in the same class that we're in. And that's true for the people on the lower end of the income scale as well. The people who are the former middle class, now lower class, those people mostly don't live in Telluride. Telluride is where the rich people live. And so they're kind of out of sight, out of mind. And then even within the communities where there is a large population of people who are struggling, it's really easy to not see them when you're there, when you're driving through. Because how often do we drive into neighborhoods? How often do we get off the road away from the shopping, away from the stores, away from the restaurants, and actually drive into neighborhoods? And then take it another step. How often do we really knock on doors and talk to people in their homes and really with our own two eyes see how they're living? So, I don't want to sound patronizing or condescending in saying, wow, it's shocking to see the hardship, but there's a lot of hardship. That's the revelation. There are plenty of people who are living more comfortably than that are leading a more traditional middle class life, like from before Reagan, for example. But the problem there is they feel that they're being pushed down, that more and more and more people are feeling pushed down into poverty. And that's why they're pissed off. That's why they're angry. That's why our politics have become so toxic. And you can just imagine this scenario. 10 years ago, some of these people heard a politician say, hope, change, we can do better. And they voted for Barack Obama. And 8 years later, they didn't feel better. And so they voted for Donald Trump. And I think that explains a bunch of the votes that went from Obama to Trump. 10 years ago, they voted their hopes, and 8 years later, they voted their fears.
So it's the economy stupid. It still is that as the main trigger?
Well, I think the economy is the root cause. I think it's easy to get confused about the income inequality and not recognize that it's the main cause because so many other things come into play as a result of the income inequality. So the income inequality is why people get racist, and it's why people become anti-immigrant. The income inequality is why people start to resent elites, people who they think are racing ahead of them. The income inequality is why the Republican Party has turned some of these wedge issues into cultural issues, which like guns and religion, those kinds of issues that got Obama in trouble when he talked about people clinging to guns and religion. The point he was making, many people have said that, I have read that the word cling was the problem in what he said. It wasn't that they cling to guns and religion. It's that people who are living under economic hardship, guns and religion are things that they have.
A sense of security.
They provide a sense of security and a sense of community.
And if you say cling, then it's like a derogatory term. That's like Hillary blew it with, what did you say?
With the deplorables, even though she was specifically referring to people who are white supremacists. That's who she was talking about. She was talking about white supremacists. But once she said the word deplorables, people just jumped and said, oh, anyone who votes for Trump, she's disparaging them as deplorables. So you have to use language really carefully. And I'm not being very political in this conversation. Maybe somebody could take a clip out of it and go, oh, look what he said. And the same thing is, and I'm aware of that, by the way, and the same thing is true of my website. I write stuff and I'm not trying to censor myself, and I'm not trying to be super careful about it, because I think that's what makes politicians, that's what really makes politicians inauthentic, is when they start worrying about what they say for fear that it will be taken out of context. And then all of a sudden they're tongue-tied. They can't say anything because they're afraid, if I talk about something, oh, they're just going to take this little clip of what I said out of context and use it to hammer me. And so politicians start saying nothing.
We will get back to media at the end.
I just dropped the head mic.
That should be fine.
Okay.
It should survive that.
No, it should survive, but it probably ruined that sound. Okay.
Now, you have established pretty well for me where we are at. Now, when you go out, what are the solutions that you're proposing to what you just mentioned, the income inequality? Incidentally, you are aware, as we talked before, very much that it's not only a US problem. So let's look at that.
Right.
What, from your liberal point of view, are the possible solutions to those things that plague society?
Well, I think the problem of income inequality here and everywhere is actually as old as civilization. There's always been a class of rulers or wealthy people who take most of the wealth in societies. And the big struggle of democracy is to create a society where the wealth is not concentrated among a very small number of people. And when wealth is concentrated among a small number of people, then it's very hard to have a democracy, because the people who are not living well vote out the government and they want change. And that change can often come in the form of authoritarian or dictatorial or non-democratic governments. And
because they promise change.
Because they promise change and people are frustrated. And then a lot of times those authoritarian, non-democratic governments do in fact redistribute wealth in ways like, say, Cuba, but at a very high cost to human dignity and freedom. Or they don't redistribute wealth like, say, today's Russia, where they just go ahead and gleefully concentrate it among the oligarchs at a very high cost to the dignity and standard of living and quality of life of the majority of the people. But in both cases, in Cuba and in Russia, of today, you don't have democracy, and so the thing that democracy depends upon, the lifeblood of democracy, is a prosperous middle class, and a middle class that constitutes a substantial majority of the population, and a middle class to which everyone can aspire, even if they're born in poorer circumstances. I mean, those are kind of fundamental requirements of a functional democracy. So I think I got a little bit away from the question you asked. I think you were asking, what are the solutions to the problem?
Well, you said, okay,
so the solution to the problem, and this is where I'm completely willing to be put myself at risk politically. The solutions are the traditional liberal solutions. The liberal solutions are, why do we think our government can't solve some of these problems for us? I mean, government can solve these problems. And the conservative in the United States answer, which is that government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. That's what Ronald Reagan said at his first inaugural address. That philosophy of conservatives in the United States, which is what brought Ronald Reagan to power, and then which he codified into conservative orthodoxy, is wrong. Government is not our problem. Government is the solution to our problems. The reason Reagan got so much traction with that argument is because government can be inefficient. It can be corrupt. It can make bad decisions. Democratic governments can do all of those things. Democratic systems can do all of those things. And so people's frustration, voters' frustration with government is real. But the solutions, in my opinion, are government that works. Government that works.
What kind of programs?
So the kinds of programs, so the specific programs I talk about when I'm campaigning are basically, the basic idea is the traditional government, Democratic Party policy platforms are not wrong. They've just been repeated so much that they sound like cliches. But one of them is that we have to have a society where if people work, they earn enough money to live on it. We cannot have a society where it is not just possible but common for people to work full-time, or sometimes more than full-time, and live in poverty. And there are tens of millions of Americans, and a lot of people in the 58th House District where I'm running, who work really hard, and they're poor. So we need to do something on the wage side. Wages have got to be, a living wage has got to be a legal requirement. And we can't just leave it to the free market to decide how much people are worth. So that's number one. Number two is we have a better society when public services are richly supported. So we are currently in Colorado and in the 58th House District and in much of America, public services have been starved to death by the philosophy that low taxes are more important than public services. So the biggest examples of public services not meeting the needs of people are underfunded education and no funding or only minimal funding through the Affordable Health Care Act of healthcare. So as a result of poor, low levels of investment in education and healthcare, people who don't earn much money are then burdened by the fact that they send their kids to schools that are underfunded. So their kids don't have an equal shot at a good future as kids do in places where the schools are well funded. Their kids don't have an equal shot at a good future as rich people's kids who can send their kids to private school. So underfunded public schools is a huge burden for the working class and the middle class. And if a large chunk of their income is going to pay healthcare costs, then that's an additional burden on them. So the people I'm talking to when I knock on doors, every single one of them, whether they voted for Donald Trump and are a Republican, whether they voted for Hillary Clinton and they're a Democrat, or whether they didn't vote at all, I've only met a few people who disagree when I say we need to fund our schools at a level that our kids can achieve well, and we need to bring healthcare to a level that we can afford to pay it. I don't think anybody disagrees with those two things. And that's because they know that those two things make it very difficult for them to prosper. When their kids aren't happy, or their kids may be happy, but when they're not happy about the education their kids are getting and they worry about that, and when too much of their income is going to healthcare, it is very, very difficult for a family to do well.
I think we're going to leave that at that. That's very clear. Health and education, that's the basis of the future.
Right.
Any society.
Health and education are the biggest issues. Others do come up that are similar, like infrastructure, which means roads and broadband and electrical power and things like that. That comes up quite a bit. And economic development, which is part of the wage piece, which is to say that the government, the state government, should invest in developing economic opportunities in these rural places so that people can earn more money. So there are other things as well. But in my campaign, when I don't have very much time to talk to people when I knock on their door. And so I go, boom, education. Did you know that Colorado is in the bottom 10 states in the United States of America for school funding? And that the cities that you live in, Montrose and Cortez, are the worst funded in Colorado. That means our public schools are the most poorly funded public schools in the entire country. And every single person goes, yep, I did. And that's really not good. And we can't live like that. Very few people take issue with that. And then when I say to them, you're paying too much for health insurance. You're paying 20 or 30% more for the same health insurance that you could buy if you lived in Denver for the same policy. It costs 20 or 30% more. And they go, I'm not surprised to hear that. And I say, well, that's not okay. And everybody agrees with those two things. There's a third thing that I also say when I knock on the doors. We're very disadvantaged here by having to pay too much for health insurance, and we're disadvantaged by underfunded schools. But we do have one great advantage living here, and that is the public lands. We live in a scenic, fantastically beautiful place with vast amounts of public land, and that land is threatened. And what would the point of being here? Why would we live here if we didn't have that, given these other problems? And I say that to people, and I say we need to defend those public lands with everything we've got. And we need to protect our access to the public lands, and we need to defend the public lands. And that's especially important now because that's where our water comes from. Everybody agrees with that. So I have found 3 issues that I campaign on. Now, some people I never get that far because they say, oh, you're a Democrat, and slam the door on me. But everyone I talk to, almost everyone I talk to, agrees that those issues are issues that need to be addressed.
Let us know, because you've been a journalist all your life, you've been an author all your life, you're somebody who's traveled widely, you live in actually Telluride is a pretty international community. Let's move away from the more local. I would like to ask you, how do you see the role of the United States in the international, in the global context? Because that has really changed. Attitudes have changed dramatically. Again, since Reagan, I would say, as far as I know. But I'm less interested in the history now. People can look that up. But I'm into your assessment as it stands now, and what you would like to see in an ideal world if you could be elected president.
Well, now we're talking essentially about what Donald Trump is up to and what he's been doing. And of course, that I'm just observing that as a citizen and as a candidate for local office that would have no impact at all on international affairs. But I do have strong opinions about it. And my belief is that Donald Trump and his politics and his personality represents an enormous threat to the international order, the global system of international treaties and trade agreements that, while very imperfect, have in fact basically preserved peace, or has preserved peace in many places, and has produced enormous economic gains for billions of people since World War II. So that international system that we're talking about of treaties and trade agreements needs to be continually improved. The international global system has had plenty of failures, like Vietnam or the Middle East. I mean, it doesn't take any anybody can point to those failures. But throwing a grenade in the middle of the international system and blowing it all up is not the answer. And that's what the United States is doing right now under Donald Trump. So I find that extremely disturbing and very worrisome. So to answer your question about what the United States should be doing internationally, I think the United States, just by virtue of its size and economic size and its military strength, has a moral obligation to help lead the international system, help be a leader within the international system. And so the kind of nationalism and the kind of America first attitude that Donald Trump expresses is exactly the wrong direction.
Let's stay here for a moment,
sure.
Because I think as somebody who's been going back and forth between the US and Europe for over 20 years now, I'm realizing that a lot has to do with language, of course,
right.
Where misunderstandings come from, like between the Democrats and the Republicans and all
right.
that. So when we see leader, it doesn't mean that the US leads anything in terms of telling people what to do.
No. It does not. Maybe a better word for an international audience would be engagement. The United States has to remain engaged. I definitely think the idea that the United States is the first among equals or the leader of all the other countries or the boss of anybody I'm not trying to suggest that at all. What I'm saying is just by virtue of its economic size and its military strength, the United States has to remain engaged in the international system of treaties and alliances, and it has to remain engaged in the United Nations because the absence of the United States makes it, and I would say the same would be true of the absence of Europe or the absence of European nations or even the absence of poor nations in small places. I mean, all nations should optimally stay within the international system. But when the biggest economy in the world turns its back on the international system, that makes it very difficult for the international system to endure. And then the threat is conflicts.
Is there a chance or a risk, depending on how you view it, that indeed, as the US is diminishing its role, that China, Russia, and so on and so forth step into that space? And is that something a lot of people say that's positive? How would you react?
Well, I think there's no question that when the United States steps back, other players step up. There's just no doubt about that. And so what that means is a complete reshuffling of the international order. And, is the international order, as it has been since World War II, with the United States as a major player, is that the best and only way that the international order should be sustained? No, there's no reason to argue that it is. So reshuffling the way the international system works, I don't have any objection to that. And if other nations assume bigger roles and do more, that could be positive or negative depending on that nation and depending on what that nation, what kind of government they have and what kind of objectives they have and what their agenda is. I personally would be very nervous of a world in which Russia under Putin or China under the current Chinese political system were to exercise a whole lot more influence in the international order than they already do, because I'm basically I believe in liberal democracy. So I think liberal democracy, with all of its flaws, is still the best system for governance out there that we know of. And so I prefer to see countries that have liberal democracies exercising as much influence as possible in the management of the international system. The problem is that under Donald Trump, we are moving toward an illiberal democracy, which could then become not a democracy at all if we're not careful. And we see the same thing happening in some of the European countries like Hungary and maybe even Italy. So that's very worrisome. I mean, illiberal democracy is a scary thing because it's just one step away from authoritarianism. And we are, in the United States, that risk is very real. And the suspense of what's going to happen in the United States with Donald Trump is painful. It is painfully suspenseful because everybody in the United States, and maybe most people in the world, see this gigantic conflict coming. This huge showdown is coming between Donald Trump and the forces of our liberal democracy. They're in conflict, and there's going to be a showdown. And none of us can have any idea how that's going to turn out.
Well, let us leave that issue there. But we've already moved into the international arena.
Right.
I have a feeling in the middle of my life now that when I look back at the 80s and 90s, even the 70s, that there were always conflicts. There was always something going on. There was always something to be worried about. But the density of worry, the sheer amount of things that people bring to me, or I talk to people about worldwide whenever I travel, and the severity has or seems to have increased. The human challenges that we are facing, if you can just let your mind wander a little bit, what are the main human challenges we're facing? Illiberal democracy and the move towards, I would say, authoritarian regimes, I would definitely say is one.
It is one, but it may not be the cause. The underlying question is, why are the liberal democracies that thrived after World War II, why are they at risk from populism? So one of the reasons is in the social inequality, and the countries that have the most social equality seem to be the least threatened by illiberal democracy. And the countries where our capitalist economies have allowed a concentration of wealth and produced a growing middle class that is struggling are where the liberal democracies are at greatest risk, broadly speaking. But you're asking what's the proximate cause?
Like what's human being, as humanity, what are we faced with right now?
So the obvious, I think the obvious answer is that even in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we recognized that unfettered growth and overpopulation and environmental degradation were not sustainable. Oop.
Don't worry, something fell.
Yeah, something fell.
Oh, that's your phone.
That's okay. My phone is turned off. It's no problem.
Start this thought again because it's very important.
You'll cut it out again.
Yeah.
So I think what we were talking about was even in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we knew that we were on an unsustainable path in terms of our human development, that overpopulation, overexploitation of the natural world, exploitation of finite resources, that these trends we were seeing were not sustainable and were going to eventually catch up with us. And I think what we're seeing now is that that's happened. I mean, the thing we always foresaw or feared has come to pass, with the most obvious example being global warming. Climate change brought about by the overconsumption of fossil fuels and the use of carbon, our carbon-based economies. So as the world has become richer, with billions of people raised out of subsistence level of living across the world, as the world has become more populous, as resources have been depleted, the piper's coming home. I mean, we're starting to see the consequences of that, which is a real threat to the survival of the planet and the survival of the species. And it's not difficult to imagine that a lot of the political stresses come from that's the originating source of it. So
as a human being, as a person, intuitively, what are your suggestions for solutions
to the global environmental?
There's the side that says, like, look, guys, Michio Kaku and all of this, we got to go to Mars. We're just going to populate, and that's what we do. It's a new frontier. It's going to be choppy, but that's what we do, and we're going to keep on doing that. And then there's the other side. It's like, this is totally crazy. We got to reduce to the max, and so on and so forth. And where you're
well, I think this, you're asking the really pertinent question here, which is, what is the relationship between our political systems and our prospects for solving the global crisis? And the relationship is obviously direct, and these things are interlocked, because we need to have functional political system in order to address our global environmental problems. And our global environmental problems are making our political systems less functional. So these things are just tightly tied together. And I have often thought that income inequality and climate change, you can't solve one without solving the other. Both of these problems have got to be solved together, because the one of the reasons we have economic inequality is because of the concentration of wealth in a carbon-based economy, the concentration of wealth among a handful of people, which makes the existing economic order is fundamentally opposed to dealing with climate change and dealing with other environmental issues. And so this is an incredibly huge, colossally enormous problem of how do we restore our democracies in a way that they can deal with these global environmental problems. And if I knew the answer, I don't think anybody knows the answer. And so that brings us back to my little running for office here in Colorado, which is, I think the answer is millions of us individually do what we can. That's the only answer I can envision, is we somehow shake off our feeling of hopelessness, our feeling of powerlessness, our feeling that we're too small to make a difference. We try to shake that feeling off, and if millions and millions of us do that, and we take steps to engage politically and hopefully restore liberalism and restore democratic values to our societies wherever we live, then those governments can theoretically join together, restore the international system, the global system we were talking about, which is falling apart, and then begin to really tackle those environmental issues which are at the root of it all.
This was such a great final word, but I'm sorry, I just gotta put one on top.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
It was nice, but really comprehensive. And thank you for being so open, saying that you don't have the solutions, because I meet so many people who think they do.
Right.
And that's part of the problem. But this would be my kind of final question for this round of talks. I hope there will be a future one. Now, all of this is incredibly difficult if you do not have information that you can rely on.
Right.
And that for me has become like the most daunting task and the most enormous threat. That even for myself, it has become very hard to discern. For myself, I mean, because I try to discern what is correct information, what is not correct information.
Right.
How do you see and how do you deal with the media environment you find yourself in, on the passive and on the active side, and information technology in general?
Right. So when we look at how we've arrived at this place where we are, with a massively unequal society where democracy is threatened, if that's the summation of where we are, and even in countries where it's not immediate, like Germany maybe, or France, that threat is still out there.
Getting there.
It's getting there. It could happen. It could happen. Let's put it that way. It could happen. So we've reached this place where these unequal societies, economically unfair societies, are threatened by populist movements which could destroy democracy. There are many causes of it. And one of those causes is the way that information has been degraded and people have lost faith in what they're taught, what they learn, what they read, what they hear. Facts have become disputed. I don't know if you're familiar with Masha Gessen, who's a phenomenal writer, Russian writer who lives in New York now and writes, but one of the titles or subtitles of one of her books about Russia was "Nothing is true and everything is possible." Let me go the other way around. Everything is possible and nothing is true. And that is her summation of life in Russia. And one of the things that she writes about is that one of the tools of authoritarianism is to create an environment in which nobody believes anything, therefore anything is possible. And there is just no question at all that Donald Trump is operating out of that playbook, where his whole political strategy is to continuously undermine our ability to know what's true and what isn't true. He didn't invent it. I mean, it dates to plenty of dictators and authoritarians before him, but he's playing out of that playbook. And then that is on top of that, you have an environment where the traditional media has been completely undermined by new technology and new media, which makes it much, much easier to spread lies. So there's no question that the whole issue of what is true and how do we know it's true and what do other people think is true and how do we live in these separate media bubbles. I don't know if you noticed, because it only just came out yesterday, James Clapper, who was the head of the Director of National Intelligence for 6 or 8 years under Obama, and I think it was just under Obama, but he just wrote a book in which he said unequivocally that he has no doubt at all that Russia swayed the election to Donald Trump. He didn't just say they interfered in our election and it's possible they had an effect. He said he has no doubt that they turned the election to Donald Trump. And he was referring mostly, he said not necessarily in actually changing votes by corrupting the voting machines, but in terms of the amount of, by the way they manipulated social media and news coverage. That's a pretty big deal, when our countries, our open societies are susceptible to that kind of manipulation, where voters can be completely moved by it. So yeah, it's a huge problem.
Regardless in what direction, of course.
Right.
And you,
for their own ends.
Let me ask you as a journalist. The chief editor of the New York Times in an interview with Stephen Colbert was saying, I think day before yesterday, in a way it's also reinvigorated journalism.
It has.
What is our answer? I mean, one answer, if I may say, is I believe that, as you said, you go as a person door to door, you look people in the eyes, personal contact. One answer. Right. As a journalist, what do you say? How do we counter that? Okay, so I have to look at this as a journalist and as a political candidate. Right.
So let me take political candidate first. Earlier we were talking about why it's been interesting to be a political candidate. And one of the reasons it's interesting is because I've had to really engage deeply with the idea of how do you actually succeed as a political candidate? What's the way to campaign successfully and effectively? And I came to the conclusion after a first couple of months of really leaning into it and talking to people and trying to think about it, that all of the traditional methods of campaigning are failing. So what do I mean by that? Nobody pays any attention to ads anymore, not really. Nobody looks at their email blasts unless they know who it's coming from. Nobody really has any confidence in social media. All of these are the traditional techniques of campaigning, at least in the United States. And so I came to the conclusion there was only one campaign methodology that worked, and that's going door to door. Because that's the only way you can get people to listen to you, especially people who don't already agree with you. It's pretty easy campaigning as a politician to get people who agree with you, or you're already in the same tribe. I can talk to other Democrats. Yeah, that's fun. That's great. We can talk all day long and we can agree nonstop about the problems, but that's not going to win the election. The only way that I can talk to people who don't already agree with me is by knocking on their door. And when I knock on their door, I would say I can only really talk to 10 or 20 or 30% of them, because many of them don't want to talk because they either are so turned off to politics that they don't want to talk to any politician, or they can tell with one glance at me that I'm probably a libtard Democrat, or they'll ask me what party I'm in, and so the conversation goes nowhere. So that goes to your question, I think, which is to say that people are so locked into their own media bubble and their own belief system that for us to talk to people who are not already in our belief system has become almost impossible outside face-to-face, individual, personal contact. Okay, so that answers the question on the political side. I would be really surprised if the advertising and the speechifying and the social media ads that is not going to win elections anymore. It just isn't.
Although we said the Russians swung it with that. So, but do you mean that was the...
Well, they did. That may have been the highlight of it. I think
right.
that may have been the highlight of it. Or
everybody's so suspicious.
Everyone is so suspicious, and everyone is already so divided. And so you did make a good counter argument to what I was saying, that it doesn't work. Maybe what I should have said more accurately is it can't work for me as a liberal in a conservative district. That might have been a better way to say it.
And as a journalist?
So as a journalist, wow, I'm stumped, because I've become really disillusioned by not so much writing. I think there's a lot of good writers. I think there's a lot of good reporters. I think there's a lot of... I'm really stumped by what I'm breaking out publishing versus writing. I think people write, but getting published in a way where you reach people has become almost impossible, because there's just so much noise and so many venues and so many mediums and so many ways for people to publish their stuff. And then the audience gravitates to stuff they already know, or stuff they already believe in, and stuff they already agree. I think the comment you made earlier that the editor of the New York Times said that in some ways Trump has inspired a revival of journalism is correct. The problem is it's correct for those of us who are in our bubble, and I hate to call it a bubble because I think of my bubble as reality, but
so does everybody.
But so do they. That's the thing you have to realize. And when you go knocking on their doors and you talk to them, and you talk to people who watch Fox News all day, they are absolutely as convinced that we're crazy as we are convinced that they're crazy.
And they were disgusted by Obama as we...
Right. Oh, I've had many people say to me, well, I hated Obama for 8 years. Look what he did. And then I'll say, well, what did he do exactly that you found so offensive? And then they go, Obamacare. And that's the end of the discussion. It's like, oh, okay. I mean, the reason that's the end of the discussion is because there's nothing I can say about Obamacare that's going to change their mind.
So
nothing.
As journalists, can we but remain, like on course and just work harder, be clearer, be kinder maybe?
I don't think we're going to convince people who are in the other bubble, but I think we still need to speak our truths and be honest and be truthful to our principles and be true to our principles of factually based journalism, accuracy in reporting, fairness in terms of representing people accurately and fairly. I mean, I think the standards of mainstream traditional journalism should be upheld by people who are in traditional mainstream journalism, and even people who are in opinion journalism should try to do that. But in terms of healing the Great Divide, which is another question, right? How do we bring these two separate bubbles, these people living in separate worlds, how do we bring them back into some kind of common space? I don't believe journalism is going to get there. I think what's going to get us there is more likely politics than journalism. And I'm not sure that we've seen a politician yet in the United States who has the leadership skills to do that, even if such a thing is possible. Barack Obama, for people in my reality bubble, or unreality bubble, whatever you want to call it, was about as good of a president as we've ever had or are likely to have. And his inability to unify the country is really sobering and distressing. So I don't think, I also am skeptical about the great leader idea, that a great leader is going to come and be able to do it. And so that brings me back to something I said earlier, which I think is the only answer I've been able to come up with. And that is, each of us individually needs to become activated and do what we can. And if millions and millions of us do it, then maybe collectively we can move the needle. That's the only answer to this crisis that I have been able to find that makes any sense to me, that I can believe in, because the other possible solutions seem so unlikely to succeed.
How many doors have you knocked on?
So I've already knocked on 2,000 doors.
How many more?
And I have 8,000 more to go. And then, of course, you have to go back, because most of those doors, there's nobody home when you knock. And so you knock on 10,000
Authority.
doors, but you only reach about 30% of the people each time. So you have to go back again and again and talk to people. But here's the reason this is unoptimistic. I can end. I don't know if this is the end or not. You're free to ask as many questions as you want. I'm not in a rush.
No.
But the most optimistic thing I can tell you is since I started knocking on doors, I have had the experience. I would say I have the experience every time I knock on doors, more than once, of talking to people who voted for Donald Trump, who are Republican, who don't like Democrats, who say they're going to vote for me. And I don't know if they really will. I think they will, because they said they will. And I've maintained relations with some of them by email afterwards, where we continue the conversation. And they know, and I don't do it by lying about what I am or who I am. I don't say, oh yeah, I like Donald Trump, true, will you vote for me? I don't do that. I go in, if they ask about him, I say, well, we may not agree about Donald Trump. Let's talk about the things we do agree on. And I have reason to think that in the 2,000 doors I've knocked on, I'll bet 20 or 30%. Well, I don't know. I don't even want to try and venture a guess. But I know that there are people who voted for Donald Trump who say they're going to vote for me.
Because the arguments...
They do it for the main reasons they do it is because I went to the trouble of knocking on their door in the first place. They respect the fact that I am working that hard. Secondly, our conversations are respectful. Even if we know that we disagree about stuff, we don't get into an argument about it. Thirdly, the issues that I discuss are issues that we agree on. And so when I say these are the issues I'm concerned about, they go, good, I'm concerned about those issues too, so I will vote for you. And then the fourth, when the issues come up where we don't agree, sometimes I have to say, yeah, I guess you can't vote for me then, and walk away and write them down as somebody who's not going to vote for me. That happens. But sometimes they say, I voted for Donald Trump and I think he's doing a good job and I'm still going to vote for you. That's liberal democracy. Yeah. It's hopeful. I would say it's hopeful. And I would say that if there are other people, if there are tens of thousands of other people right now doing exactly what I'm doing, and I think there probably are in the United States, that is what political change will look like. Because we will win a lot of elections. I might not win mine because I have 30 points to make up, plus 30 Trump district. But a lot of people who are approaching the problem the same way I am, by getting involved, talking to people, knocking on doors, campaigning hard, are going to win. And then that is the only hope I see.